Hi, I'm Kim Williams from Kansas State University, and I'm pleased to provide this eGrow presentation on the topic of carbon dioxide fertilization. We don't often think of carbon as a plant nutrient, but in fact, it makes up about 40% of a plant's dry mass, which is greater than any other plant nutrient. Plants fix carbon from carbon dioxide in the air via the process of photosynthesis and then evolve it during respiration. In 2013, the air contains about 400 parts per million carbon dioxide, and about 350 parts per million CO2 is sufficient to support plant growth. So it would be reasonable to think then that we don't need to worry about providing plants with carbon because they get what they need from the air. And for the most part, that's true. But there are two ideas that I want to share with you regarding why CO2 fertilization may be necessary. The first of these is that in primordial times, plants evolved with carbon dioxide levels that were 10 or more times greater than the levels found today. This suggests that plant species have the capacity to put greater concentrations of CO2 that naturally occur to use to accomplish more rapid growth, and this is true for most species. The second idea is that in a sealed greenhouse, like a poly-covered structure, plants can exhaust the supply of CO2 inside, leading to slowed growth due to carbon deficiency. There are a wide range of documented effects of CO2 fertilization on plants: a promotion of lateral shoot growth, which would be an advantage for crops like spray mums, but is a disadvantage for crops like cut snapdragons; decreased bud abortion, increased size of stem and flowers; weight increases and accelerated plant growth has been well documented in crops like hydroponically produced lettuce; and an increase in tomato and cucumber fruit production. For most crops, increased growth occurs up to 1,000 to 1,500 parts per million CO2. Remember that all factors that control photosynthesis must be taken into consideration, as photosynthesis will only occur as fast as the most limiting input. Therefore, CO2 fertilization may result in the necessity of boosting other inputs like temperature, increasing fertilization rate, and or boosting light intensity to support an increased rate of growth with the additional CO2. The law of limiting returns is at play with CO2 fertilization. That is, more is not always better, economically speaking. As an example of research results that are applicable across a range of crops, the biggest effect comes from raising the CO2 levels from 200 parts per million to ambient conditions, or near about 400 parts per million. There's proportionally less gain as levels are raised from 400 parts per million to 1,000 parts per million. And depending on the crop, a saturation point will be reached where there's no benefit at all from adding more CO2 to the production environment, as shown by these flattening curves in this graph. And remember that you will only achieve benefit as long as no other input into photosynthesis is limiting, such as light. The two lines on this graph represent increasing light levels, where we have photosynthesis rates reaching saturation much sooner when light levels are low at only 150 micromoles per meter squared per second of light, compared to when light intensity is increased to 1,400 micromoles per meter squared per second. You can see that the increasing rate of carbon dioxide results in an increased rate of photosynthesis because the extra light is there that's necessary to support that photosynthetic process. So, how is carbon dioxide fertilization done? Well, one older way is with a CO2 generator. You can see one hanging here in this slide. Burners hang overhead and burn a liquid fossil fuel like natural gas, propane, or kerosene, consuming up to 60 cubic feet of natural gas per hour. The burners aren't all that expensive, but the fuel bills are. An advantage might be that heat is also generated during the generation of the CO2, so the heat provided can contribute to the needed heat for the greenhouse production space. Injecting CO2 from liquid or dry ice storage tanks is an option for larger growers. This offers the advantage of purity and releases no heat, which may or may not be an advantage. In this photo, CO2 is delivered into the crop canopy through small holes in the inflated plastic tube. A third mode of injection is a part of the design of heating systems of modern greenhouses. Waste carbon dioxide from combustion-based heating systems is routed into the production environment. So essentially CO2 doesn't have to be generated. The waste CO2 from the heating system is, if it's pure enough of course, is just routed to the production environment and taken advantage of with increased growth. In thinking about when to fertilize with CO2, there are a number of things to consider. First, you should only inject when photosynthesis could occur, which is during daylight. So a CO2 injector could be on a timer, for example, that would only allow it to turn on during daylight hours. Secondly, if the greenhouse is being vented, there is absolutely no need to inject because the concentration will not be able to build much beyond ambient. And therein lies a key problem with CO2 fertilization. Only growers in production regions where venting is minimal can rely on benefits from this technology. So growers in the south who have to vent even in the winter makes CO2 fertilization much less viable. Finally, it is possible to analyze for CO2 and inject when levels fall below optimal, as is being done with this CO2 analyzer that you see in this photo from a research greenhouse. So, in the northern U.S., it's not uncommon to inject CO2 for 5 or so hours per day during the winter months, when the increased yield and shorter production time can contribute favorably to the economics. In the winter in the north, venting greenhouses is more minimal because growers are trained to retain the heat in the structure. But in the southern U.S., ventilation is often necessary during the winter, so it just usually doesn't make sense to invest in the equipment to inject CO2. Food for thought for all growers, however, is that carbon dioxide deficiency can occur in any plant canopy if air movement is poor. This will result in slowed growth or poorer yield. It pays to take note of managing air movement between plants, not only for disease control, but also to ensure that carbon dioxide levels are being replaced as plants deplete these levels via photosynthesis in production spaces with stagnant air. Thanks to my colleagues at the partnering universities for this eGrow project, and a special thanks to the Fred C. Glockner Foundation for funding this eGrow series.